categories. When you look at quotations and such of the Old Testament and the New, there's kind of 4 categories. One is it's very clear that the apostolic author is drawing on something that, so far as we can tell, because again, we don't have the handwritten copy of something from Moses. We're having to reconstruct it from the evidence that we do have. But so far as we can tell, they are drawing on something that is closer to what we know as the Hebrew and is different from what we find in the quote-unquote Septuagint. So a good example of that is, actually was going over that this morning when the Matthew 2 quotation of out of Israel I have, out of Egypt I called my son. Even though Matthew's writing in Greek and he's quoting Hosea 11, the wording that he is using is clearly from the Hebrew, because the Hebrew says exactly that, just in Hebrew, out of Egypt I called my son. And the Greek that we know, as far back as we can reconstruct it, for Hosea 11 says, out of Egypt I called my children, which is not the same thing, it's plural. And so he can't be using, that argument wouldn't have worked for him. So he can't be using the Septuagint. He's got to be using, he's got to be using some form that is the closest to the Masoretic. So that's one category where it's like they seem to be using something that's closer to the Hebrew. Then maybe there's 3 categories. Then there's a middle category, which is the Greek and the Hebrew are functionally indistinguishable. Okay. So you wouldn't know either way. So a lot of times, like when they quote Leviticus 19:18, the Hebrew says one thing, the Greek says verbatim what the Hebrew says. It's not hard. There's no mystery here. It's a very faithful word for word rendering of love your neighbor as yourself. And then when the New Testament authors quote that verse multiple times, they're all identical. And you don't really care whether they're getting it. You don't know if they're getting it from the Hebrew or the Greek, because the Greek and the Hebrew are functionally the same, just in different languages. So that's probably the majority, actually, where the Greek as we know it in the quote-unquote Septuagint is so close to what we know in the Hebrew that they're basically the same, and it's fine, right? Close enough. So yeah, maybe they're using the Septuagint, but there's no real difference. And then the more interesting category is Paul or whomever is quoting something from Isaiah or what have you, and it's really close to the Septuagint or identical to Septuagint, and it differs from what we have in the Hebrew in some meaningful ways. And there's, depending on where you want to draw the line, there's a pretty good number of those where it's like, okay, it seems pretty likely that they're making their point based on some wording that is found in the Greek, and when you compare it to my Hebrew Bible that I got for seminary, it's not the same, because the Greek translator, for whatever reason, either there's 2 reasons why this would happen. Either they interpreted it in a different way, and sort of in their translation, they became more sort of New Living Translation and more loose, if you will, as opposed to being kind of NASB style and being word for word. Or the Hebrew they were translating might not have been identical to what we have today. Does that make sense?
Gotcha.
Because the Hebrew that we have, and you see this in your Old Testament, right? When you read the Old Testament, 99% of the time, like, yeah, it's pretty secure here. But there's the 1% of the time where it's like, actually, here's one Hebrew version. Here's what we have from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Here's what we have from whatever. And so we're not 100% sure. So even the ESV will have those kinds of footnotes and Deuteronomy 32 and that kind of stuff. So they could just be translating from a different Hebrew. Does that mean it's the better Hebrew? We don't know. It just means that the scribes weren't perfect in terms of how they copied it. So there could be different reasons. So that category of they're making an argument based on the Septuagint only is really relevant when it's differing from what we know from the Hebrew. And so that one's the interesting category.
Well,
and more debated.
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious about that. Like, what do we make of those differences? You said it could have been that the textual tradition of the Hebrew text could have variants, I guess, and that they're translating those, so you'd expect variations. Mm-hmm. Or maybe they're kind of interpreting it, trying to show, lean the reader toward a particular understanding of the Hebrew via their translation, something like that. When Paul is quoting Septuagint, or I don't know, one of the New Testament authors, are they aware of what the Hebrew says and they're choosing to use the other one? Or like, how are they, are they going, this translation kind of gets more what I'm saying? Or does that make sense? Like, what was, right? I mean, what did they think they were doing?
Right. I mean, those are all, the natural questions. That the challenge is it's almost impossible to answer those questions. And here's why. Well, we can't like inquire what's happening in Paul's mind, right? If we have him in the third chair here, we could ask him. So we're trying to piece it together based on evidence that we have. And the reason why that's such a vexed discussion is because you have Paul quoting it a certain way. And it could be a conscious decision to adopt a certain wording that he thinks fits his arguments better than what we now know as the Masoretic. And then you'd have to deal with those kind of implications. Or it could just be the wording that he was familiar with that just happens to not be what later gets put in the Masoretic in the first millennium text that we use for our English Bibles. And you don't know.
But would they have been aware of the Hebrew text? Like, would they?
Well, what I'm saying is it's almost, to call it the Hebrew text is actually not even terribly accurate, because yes, there is a stable textual tradition, sure.
Yeah.
But it's not perfect. And we know that from a lot of evidence. In fact, your English Bibles mention all that stuff. The Syriac says this, or the Targum say this, or whatever. Samaritan Pentateuch. You see these things in your footnotes. Yeah. So no one's trying to hide anything. But to say, was Paul aware of what the Hebrew said, is kind of a funny way to phrase it, because there's a limited amount of diversity in what the Hebrew even was. And again, you can demonstrably prove that from the manuscripts that we have. So he would probably just kind of be puzzled at the question, like, what do you mean by saying the Hebrew? Because in the synagogue that he's working from, it says this. And that may not be the same thing that later becomes known as the Masoretic text in 1000 AD, which has an earlier history. So it's kind of a funny thing to ask. Like, you just don't know.
I guess I'm wondering if the Bible he grew up with was the Septuagint. Does that make sense? Like, if that was,
I think the Bible he grew up with is similar to what we have today in a certain sense, where, I grew up with the NIV 84. So my memorization of certain verses is NIV 84.
Okay.
And then I read it in the ESV and I'm like, it's different than what I grew up with.
Yeah, yeah.
Or I read it in NIV 11 or CSB or whatever. And in other words, we all exist, unless you're in, a KJV only circle, we all exist in a plurality of texts that are all basically saying the same thing, but with some variation. Even having kids like, oh, why does it say it this way here? It's like, well, it's complicated. Having to explain those kinds of things. And so my sense is, as Paul is traveling around, as a Pharisee, certainly he would have known Hebrew and would have interacted with the Bible in Hebrew. That doesn't mean it was always everywhere the same Hebrew. You could have local variations in Jerusalem where it got copied slightly differently here. And if he's on the road, he doesn't have a whole Torah cabinet with him. Right? Those are huge. And so when he gets to Corinth and he's going to write some stuff, he's got to go to the local synagogue. It's like, oh, it's slightly different there. And maybe it's Hebrew, maybe it's Greek. Don't know. It could be both. And so so maybe the takeaway is it's actually just way more complicated than I think folks realize, which folks don't like complexity. I get that. I don't like it either. I mean, I think it's fun. It helps pay the bills for me, but it's like to ask these kinds of questions. I hate to not give solid answers, but it's actually really hard to pin down, because you're like, take Matthew as another example. Matthew was bilingual. He was Levi in his Jewish side of his life. He's had two names, because as many did. He was Matthew for his day job as a Roman tax collector, right? So his day job, he's speaking Greek, and then back home he's speaking Hebrew. And he's an educated man. And in Matthew, when you read his quotations, sometimes they seem to be closer to what we now know as the Hebrew. Sometimes they seem to be a little bit closer to, quote unquote, the Septuagint. Sometimes they're kind of in between, when he quotes Isaiah 42 and Matthew 12. And so you're kind of scratching your heads like, well, which Bible is he using? And you're like, well, like all of them, because he's multilingual and an apostle who's traveling around and using what he had. Maybe he's memorized some of it. Sometimes he's quoting from memory. Sometimes maybe he's looking at a written, printed text, but it might not be exactly the same in Capernaum as it is in Jerusalem, or whatever. So it's all just complicated. When you have memorization, local variant copies, the linguistic stuff with Hebrew and Greek here and there. So as a side note that hopefully will be better answers to this. So Will and I are editing a volume with systematic theologians, historical theologians, and so on, Reformation people, and so on, that is trying to answer some of these questions in a more helpful way. We tried to in the Crossway book, but only got part of the way there. And so it's going to be called The Authority of the Septuagint, a sort of multidisciplinary perspective. And so we have people much smarter than us, John Fesco and others, who are saying, okay, how do we grapple when we believe in certain doctrine of Scripture and a certain doctrine of the preservation of the Hebrew and the Greek?
Yeah.
How do we grapple with some of these questions of, well, what if, here's another example. What if Paul cites this verse from the Old Testament, and the wording he uses is different than what Matthew does and is different than what James does, which actually happens for passages where they are all going back to the same text, like Deuteronomy 6, 4 and 5, or Isaiah 6, another example. It's quoted in all four Gospels plus Acts, and every single quotation of Isaiah 6, 9 through 10 is different in Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts. And so what do you do with that? How do we think about that in light of these considerations? And one of the people contributing is like, it kind of just seems like the New Testament authors didn't care about the question, that they're just using whatever text they had available. Yeah. They didn't sort of pour all of this angst about things. They're like, okay, I'm writing to this audience. I'm in Antioch. Lo and behold, I looked up the copy of Isaiah 6 in Antioch, and this is what it said. And then maybe I tweaked a little bit. I dropped a word. I summarized it, because we do that when we preach. It's almost like they didn't seem stressed about it, because they're just using God's word to preach. They just didn't feel as like uptight about it as
right.
Maybe. And so anyway, we'll see. We'll see where it goes.
Well, maybe we wouldn't if we lived in those days,
right? Because quotation standards are so different. I mean, there is no app with the Bible on it in that day. I mean, the printing press era, the digital era makes everything so different. Where we think, like when the ESV, not to throw stones at them, when they said we're now doing the permanent edition in 2016 of the ESV, and everyone pitched a fit, like, what are you talking about? Like, this is it forever for the next 500 years? You're never changing it? And they backed off of that because, like, look, English changes, we update stuff. We find new manuscripts that maybe correct our reading. So like there's a new edition of Revelation coming out by the Brainiacs in Germany, and it'll impact the future editions of the Greek New Testament, and it has 100 changes in it. I don't know what they are yet. Haven't bought it yet. But so it's like, all right, what are you going to do with that? Because now we think, based on our evidence that we've gathered over the past 50 years, that actually we need to tweak it here and there, and this is a better version of Revelation. So that kind of stuff keeps happening.
Have you read the Gen Z Bible?
Is that the one with like emojis and stuff, or I don't know? It's
got all kinds of Gen Z. You would love it.
Oh, nice.
You would love it. You would love it.
So point being, it just was a profoundly different world. And so maybe part of the Septuagint stuff is sort of getting back to like, hey, let's be historically grounded, and hey, we don't have to panic, but also let's know really what's happening back then. And I find it to be really interesting and engaging. But